Hey there, readers. Hey there, scholars. Hey there, fourth grade. Miss Korma here for your fantastic Friday Flipgrid. So, readers, I really hope that you guys have really been enjoying your time learning about the legacy and the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And so, I wanted to focus today's Flipgrid on his life. And I wanted to share with you a very special article that I found, an essay written about him. And so, today I wanted to connect it to the writing that we've been working on. Now, all of week we've been writing on persuasive essays. Now, we know what persuasive essays are where we write to change people's minds. And today I wanted to focus on our skills of coming up with a strong claim, a strong opinion, and supporting it with, starts with an R, reasons. So today I wanted to share with you a very awesome article written by a man named Jim Haskins. Now, this is Jim over here. And Jim Haskins was a very famous author. And he wrote an essay about Martin Luther King Jr. And what makes him unique, a unique author, is that he actually grew up in the time when Martin Luther King Jr. was alive. And so he actually got to see firsthand the protest. And he actually lived in a time of segregation, when there was segregation in schools. And remember, segregation means when children were placed in different schools just based on their different skin color. So people that were white would go to one school, and people that were black or brown would go to one school. They weren't allowed to integrate or be together. So they were segregated or separated. And so Jim Haskins actually grew up in a time where people were segregated and they weren't allowed to go to the same movie theaters, the same swimming pools, the same schools. And so he grew up in there, and during that time, and he saw Martin Luther King Jr., lead protests and stand up and believe that people shouldn't be treated different just because of their skin color. And so today, I wanted to share with you an article that Jim wrote called Martin Luther King Jr., a Timely Leader. And as I read today, writers, readers, fourth graders, I want you to think, do you agree with Jim Haskins? Do you believe that Martin Luther King Jr. is a good leader? And I want you to come up with 3 reasons why, based on the text evidence, on why he is a good leader. So let's go ahead and read this article together. Martin Luther King Jr., A Timely Leader by Jim Haskins. The civil rights era was a time of great change in American society. During this time period, many people struggled to win fair treatment and equal rights for African Americans. Their fight is known as the Civil Rights Movement. No leader was more closely linked to this moment in history than Martin Luther King Jr. King and the movement are very important to me. So remember, this is Jim's words, not mine. I'm an African American who was born in the South. I grew up in a time of segregation. Segregation forced Black people to be separate from white people in public places. This included schools, restaurants, and more. There were so many places I could not go. From the town park to the public library, I was not allowed in because of the color of my skin. I hated the unfairness. I was in Montgomery, Alabama during the bus boycott that began the Civil Rights Movement. During the boycott, African Americans refused to ride city buses. They did this to protest the unfair treatment, including segregation. Many years later, I returned to my hometown. I donated copies of my books I had written to the public library. This was the same public library I could not enter as a child. My niece happened to be sitting there when I arrived. I was struck by the great achievements of King and so many others in the civil rights struggle. Strength and skills needed for change. King was the right man at the right time. African American leaders before him had some of the same qualities, and African Americans had had their opportunities to win civil rights. But during the 1950s and 60s, events came together to make American society open to change. King had the strength and the skills to bring about the change. This is where you listen carefully, because we're going to see what made him a good leader. King was a young Baptist minister when he got involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. He stood out for his brilliance as a public speaker. He had the power to inspire others to follow him. King was also lucky. He came just at the right time. Change had already begun in the late 1940s. That was when President Harry S. Truman ended segregation in the 1950s in a Supreme Court case called Brown versus Board of Education. The ruling declared that segregated education is unconstitutional. It goes against the U.S. Constitution, the ruling stated. Separate schools for white and black kids would no longer be allowed in the United States. Ugly images on television. Finally, advances in technology made the right time for large protests. In many places, whites responded to peaceful civil rights protests with violence. Television spread the ugly images of this across the nation. It was impossible for Americans to ignore what was going on. Martin Luther King Jr. was a gifted speaker. He could speak to a television camera as well as he could to a church group. The media played a major role in creating his image as a moral leader of a nation. Thousands of people responded to his call. They looked to him as a source of hope and inspiration. Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. In 1964, Congress finally passed the Civil Rights Act. It passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These two laws laid the groundwork for protecting civil and voting rights for African Americans. With this accomplishment behind him, King had turned his attention to other problems. For example, he spoke out about the Vietnam War. He did not believe the United States should be involved in the war. It was not clear It is not clear if King would have been as powerful fighting for other causes. He was shot and killed in 1968, but the influence he had during this important time in history was unmatched. In his honor, the U.S. government made King's birthday a national holiday. King is the only non president in the United States to be given this honor. So this is just a note from the editor, from people that published this article. It says, this essay was written by Jim Haskins. It was printed in 1995. Haskins was born in Alabama in 1941. After going to college, he became a teacher and later a writer. Haskins wrote more than 100 books for children and adults. Many are about the achievements of African Americans. He won many awards for his books. Haskins died in 2005 at the age of 63. So, readers, today we read an essay about Martin Luther King Jr. And I want you to think to yourself, what made him such a good leader? Why did people want to follow him? What made him somebody that people wanted to stand up and fight for civil rights, for people to be treated fairly, for all people to be treated fairly, despite what their skin color is? So you've done a lot of work. You've done a lot of work learning about MLK in morning meeting and even this article. So today, I challenge you on your Flipgrid. I want you to think about Martin Luther King was a good leader because what are your 3 reasons? You're going to tell me your claim and your 3 reasons why you think he's a good leader. All right, I can't wait to see your responses. Happy MLK Day, readers. I hope you have an amazing day. Make sure that you do something to take care of others, just like MLK would.